was an advertisement in the New York Times for the Moskowitz dancers, and there was a image of a dancer, photograph of him. He had both arms thrown out, and he had his legs thrown out, and I said, oh, God, that's so marvelous. That's what I want to do. And you see there's an X there of that figure. Then I thought, well, this needs more. And you see, I then worked these curling in and out there. And to tell you the truth, I really had what I thought was inspiring. You know that wonderful neon Coca-Cola sign across from the United Nations. All this is wonderful curving. But look at this. Oh, you can turn that on, Marissa, the one on the right. Yes, Leaping Laocoon. And I thought, oh my goodness, it's the Laocoon. This you have to see to believe. It's exquisite. It's not as big as you might think. It's in the Vatican. It's every bit as great as everyone said. You really cannot know what sculpture can be until you get to Rome. The Greco-Roman things, the Michelangelo, those Bernini, the two angels in San Andrea della Frate, I mean, a room temperature butter carved. It's absolutely extraordinary. Also in Rome, scale. You can't know what scale is. You can't know what people were able to do with stone. It's one of the great Italy, that particular part of Italy, one of the great stone-working cultures of all time. It's up there with the Greeks and the Indians and the French of the Gothic cathedrals. Now, we're backtracking a little because I want to switch to another subject. These are the same subjects. This is, of course, the very famous painting. It's in the Louvre. This is a Chatsworth. There's a 10-year difference between them. I want to point out to you, see all this dark, all of this was added. There, this was originally been a much tighter composition. You see the change in the painting technique. This is very broadly, fluidly painted. You see how much more expensive these people look. Everything, look at those fabrics, very polished. On the other hand, it's very austere. This has a very generic Baroque quality. Dramatically, it doesn't quite work. You see, everybody's rushing up. There's that pathos, that Baroque pathos of movement. But do people really rush up to inert objects? I'm not so sure. What they're doing is reading an inscription. They're doing the same thing here. The inscription says, "Et in Arcadia ego." I, too, lived in Arcady. And which means, of course, it pleased the poets to think of Arcadia. I mean, in fact, it's not a very easy place to make a living, but the idyllic lives and loves of the shepherds. But you see, even in that idyllic setting, death is there well, here they've been stopped dead in their tracks, as you can see. I mean, it's all so much more moving. There's that monumental tomb in the center, but look how much more open it is than this painting. See, the corners are open. The whole thing has been suspended from the top. Even that great massive weight. Look at all this space around, and for all the seriousness of the subject, the gravity, look at this great arch. You see that? Gives it the whole thing a wonderful lift. Now, we approach a very grave moment. I was in, it's 1987, I was out in Los Angeles. I was visiting with David Hockney. He had drained his swimming pool. He was painting waves on it. And there was a friend there with a camera. And we took a little break and went back into the house for a cup of tea. With the greatest casualness, he said to me, I hear that Charles Ludlam is in St. Vincent's. He has pneumonia, and he weighs less than 100 pounds. Well, the horror, I could have been stabbed in the chest. And the horror on my face must have been very visible. The person with the camera started photographing me. Somewhere that expression exists. But I ran out of the house. And David followed me out and calmed me down and got me back in, and said, I assumed you knew. Of course, Charles had been very secretive. He had gotten thinner, but he anticipated questions. He says, oh, I'm on this wonderful diet, a macrobiotic. It fooled us, and there could be long times when we didn't see him because he'd be working on a new play. At any rate, I got back in time to see him 3 times at the hospital, and then he died at the end of May, 1987. And a whole series of paintings came out of my grief. And I must say I'd been a very lucky person up till then. I had never really experienced grief. I suppose modern medicine and my grandparents were remote, and my mother's parents were dead, and so I didn't have that. And so it was really, this was a very new experience for me. I had no idea how much you could suffer. And this was the first painting I did. It was done in June, and it's called Bound for Glory. It's a very typical human response. No, the hero is not dead. The future lies ahead. And it even, you can see it as a kind of 20th century equivalent of an ascension, a Christ out of the tomb. Now, in fact, Charles was bound for glory. Here are his collected plays. They're performed all over America, primarily in the drama departments of the universities and colleges. All of the kids love them. They can't get enough of them. They have such wonderful parts. And now some of you may be too young to have heard of Charles, but when he died, it was on the front page of the New York Times. It was felt to be a catastrophe for the American theater. And this is the biography, which came out 3 years ago. When it did, the New York Times excerpted some sections from it and had 2 photographs and half a page in the Arts and Leisure section. They hadn't forgotten Charles. They knew how important he was. And Mel Gusso wrote a big review. Frank Rich was one of the great champions of Charles's work, and now he's writing on the op-ed page, writing those wonderful anti-Bush tirades, which we all can't get too much of. Yeah. And this is a volume of Charles's collected writings, which are absolutely wonderful. Anyway, Bound for Glory. Now, the one on the right, this was the next one. It's called Stressed Heart. It wasn't anything I planned. It happened. And I even had a kind of hysterical heart attack. You can have their imitation heart attacks. I had a pain down my left arm and an incredible sense of oppression in my chest. I had to lie down. But I didn't set out to paint a heart. I didn't set out to paint a stressed heart, but if that is not a stressed heart, I don't know what is. Now, this is called The Blue Theater. It's a large painting. It's 90 inches by 96 inches. It's in the Museo Contemporaneo in Mexico City. Now, I'm endlessly amazed by really how sometimes how little I understand what's going on in my own work. Other people can point things out to me that I haven't seen from many, that I never saw. I showed a postcard of this to someone, and he said, with the greatest care, he just took a glance at it. He says, oh, well, that's somebody. These are 2 people. I said, oh, my God, you're right. And look, joined at the hip. I was flabbergasted. Now, Charles was a patron of mine a collector of my work, a collaborator. I did sets for 2 productions. Now, I know Brokeback Mountain is open this week, but I don't want anyone to imagine that this was a romance. It wasn't. I think friendship is probably one of the most underrated relationships. And also with Charles, one always looked forward to the next plays. I would see them 4 or 5 times. I go with my friends. So it was a part of my life. And when I lost him, I really lost an ally. I felt horribly alone. And it really took me 5 years to get over it. And what was bad about it was that since I had never experienced grief, of course, I was terribly curious about it. I wanted to experience it fully, but I didn't realize how dangerous grief is, that it's really a very a deadly thing. This is called Hope and Sorrow. I did this in the summer. Here we have a premature attempt to escape from gloom. It's called Sorrow Banished in a Spanish frame. This was too early to try to get rid of it. We were going to go much further down on all of this. Now, this is another death from 1987. It's Chris Wilmarth, whom I knew. As you know, he died by his own hand. Everybody, when they look at this, they think the Guggenheim. What you see, the bottom has fallen out. The Guggenheim is, in fact, one of my favorite buildings. I went to the funeral. I came back feeling unbelievably weird, and as never before or since, absolutely had to pick up a brush and paint. And of course, the first thing that got done was that. And I think whenever you see, when you see this impulse inward, this rush inward, it's always a sign of pain. And you see expansiveness, outwardness. This is centripetal as opposed to centrifugal. Now, this is called Tarkovsky. You know, the great Russian film director, the man who made that movie about the Russian icon painter, Andrei Rublev. You see this inwardness, this going towards the center. I think this is very related to the view out my window. This is probably a moon. But there's a lot of suffering in this. Now, what I want to do, this painting is called A Landscape with a Man Killed by a Serpent. You see this? You see, it's already gray with death. You see that terrible python that has killed him. I use the word sublime with great caution. I like it, it's not an honorific term of valorization for me. I think it should be used in the original sense of horror and fear. And I can't imagine Poussin being able to do that. That must have been so hard to paint. But I'll relate this to the next image after this one, but I want to keep it. This is called Death Drove the Taxi, and a friend of mine said, she's here tonight, she said, you were looking into a corner. I thought that was very deep. And well, you see this no way out. Now this is I think maybe I've painted 2 sublime paintings in my life. And the first one was in 1970, and it doesn't fit into this narrative. But this is called Abyssness. And look at this coil. I was in the coils of something. This coil was the first thing that went in, and everything else followed that stayed. And I was awfully close to the edge, as you can see. I think this is kind of a benchmark. This is how close you can get to jumping without actually jumping. But I'm very proud of this. But this was the darkest part of the whole process, and this was 3 years later. And then I started pulling out of it. Now, this is called 5 years later. You see the blue, but we get color coming in. I think this is a rather Poussin-esque composition. You see you have a shelf of space here, that you have a barrier, then you have this great bowl of space in the background. Now, I hope this looks not labored. I hope this looks easy, but something like this takes a tremendous amount of planning. And I love the idea of the figure and the ground being the same color. It's a good trick. Now, this is also in the same vein. On the left, this painting is called Diana, Huntress, Chaste and Fair. It's in the Brooklyn Museum. Nancy Graves bought it out. We were great friends, and she gave it to the museum. And, of course, when she died in 1995, we were all pretty shook up by it. And the painting on the right is called Her Gracious Sway. And I dedicated it to her because I thought it had some of the swing and sway of that sculpture of hers. You know, if anyone understood the spine and bending and graceful movement, and she herself had the most glorious carriage. I greatly admired her, and I thought she had, well, as I wrote a letter to her husband, and I said she was a flawless gem of moral worth, and of course greatly missed. We were exact contemporaries. I think she was 6 months older than me. Now we are going to have a complete change of pace and engage in a little self-criticism. I've got this wonderful quote from Spinoza, who was a contemporary of Poussin's, of course, lived in Northern Europe. And listen to what he has to say about everything I've been talking about. A free man thinks of nothing less than of death, and his wisdom is a meditation not of death, but of life. I found my way to Spinoza. It's in a very roundabout way. I loved Wagner's music enormously. Wagner was very influenced by Schopenhauer. I read Schopenhauer in order to understand Wagner, and believe me, it opened my eyes. Schopenhauer was a great fan of Spinoza. I read Nietzsche because I love Wagner's music. Of course, Nietzsche was a friend of Wagner before he turned against him, as he turned against everyone, but and wrote very intelligently about Wagner's music. Nietzsche was also a friend of Spinoza, so how could I not? I must say, this is the hardest book I've ever read, and I've read it exactly once. I can't really imagine reading it again. I mean, Heidegger's Being in Time is a long way away as a second in difficulty. Now, on the left, of course, you see this wonderful painting. It's in Washington, the National Gallery, and it's Bellini's Feast of the Gods, and on the right you see Titian's The Andrians. It's in the Prado. Both these paintings were in Rome in the Aldobrandini Palace. We know that Poussin did a copy of the Bellini. It's in Scotland. And he had a very hard time when he first came to Rome. He knew real destitution. Probably the fact that he did copy proved that he, had a hard time making money, and that's what people did. But we are now going to see Poussin kick up his heels, and intoxication and all those good things are in the offing. Also in the Aldobrandini, beside this Titian, was the Titian Worship of Venus, which is also in the Prado. That Titian is in the Prado now. And the Ariadne and the Bacchus and Ariadne, which is in the National Gallery in London. Ooh, here we go. Everybody's grabbing at everybody else. You can see the party is in full swing and drunkenness. But you see where this painting is a good 130, 140 years later than the Bellini. But look at the trees. the mountains. But you see, with Poussin, you get this stage-like arrangement with the kind of straight figures in a straight line in the back. But I thought you would enjoy this. We've been seeing some rather grave imageries. We've been talking about grave things, but we get to kick up our heels from time to time. The one on the right is out in Kansas at the Nelson Atkins. Another one. You see this Bacchante on the left. She'd get into serious trouble today. She's squeezing grapes. You see the little Puto. He's got his cup up. He's going to get some. And I wanted you to have these in mind because I wanted to discuss these portraits, and I think I really have a contribution to make in terms of understanding what's going on. The one on the left is very, very famous. It's in the Louvre, and of course that's greatly affected its reputation. The one on the right is in Berlin in the Stadtliche Museum, and the one on the right is brutally cropped. And originally, we have an engraving of this. Originally, it had the same proportions as this. But you see these carved figures, the top of their heads has been removed. And not only would you have the head, but there was quite a large space up here, and it's been cropped all the way around. But what I think we have here is Poussin was interested in ideal beauty. He did not paint portraits. He had to be persuaded to paint these. This one was they're both painted for two of his biggest collectors. They were Parisians. This for a man called Chanteloup. This for a man called Pointel. We have the letters. Poussin said, no, I don't want to do it. Can't you find somebody else? And then finally, he agreed. And I think what he decided to do, okay, I've got to do this. I'm going to make a statement. I'm going to tell the world what I stand for. I'm going to use each one of these portraits to tell, here's the one who does the serious subjects, the religious subjects. Here's the one with drunken revelry, naked, beautiful people chasing each other in drunken states. Look at the everybody has remarked, of course, on the severity of the glance here. I want, as an artist, I think I can point something out to you. You see the eyes? You see these lines of these picture frames? You see how the eyes are locked in? There's no there's no moving there. And you are fixed by that stare. This is thought to be an allegory of painting. Here you see a figure. You see these hands reaching out to embrace this figure. Some think she's a figure of painting. Or you see she has a diadem. There's an eye. She's thought to be truth. Someone reaching out to embrace truth. This is the hard truth, which you're seeing here. This is the soft truth. Now, this painting has also suffered because Poussin was very clever. He, writing to Chanteloup, he said, I'm working on the first portrait. I'll give you the one that I think is the best. Well, he gave him this one, which is the second one. This is from 1650. This is from 1649. And But here you see this great wreath. Do you see how this separates the head from the body and gives it a lightness? Look how the hair completely frames the head. Here it comes down so that you see, you're locked in. It stops right there. I want you to notice this incredibly sinuous silhouette there. This is much sharper, much more sculptural. When you look at this expression, it's very ambiguous. It's what the French call a sourire flottant, this slightly smiling expression. And I think when you're looking at the mouth, in your peripheral vision, you see this very wavy edge. And it affects how you see that mouth. It actually seems to be moving. You see how the head is tilted? That's a forgiving man. He's going to give us a pass. He's going to let us cut loose, let it rip. And you see the activity of the silhouette and the swagger of the cloth that goes over the shoulder. Here you see this mantle, very severe, following the base of the painting. The contrasts here are much darker. They're much paler here. Here you see he's holding a drawing instrument in his hand. I would say this is an allegory of sculpture. Sculpture evokes, life studies, drawings after sculpture, and of course, the life and loves of the gods. Do you find this convincing? No one has ever interpreted these paintings in this way, as related and as individual statements. I would call this comedy and this tragedy. Oh, I have to tell you, this painting was cleaned for the show in 1995 for a very long time. On the spine of this portfolio was painted lumine et colore, of light and color. It appears all cleaned, and the words are gone. Well, there must have been quite a few art historians whose hearts sank when they saw that they were gone, because you could imagine how much ink flowed because of those words. But the restorer said that he felt that they had been added later. But he didn't actually remove them. He painted them over. So who knows, in 30 years, we may see them back there again. Oh, by the way, you could read a whole shelf of books about these paintings. Look at this. Hair parted in the middle, hair parted on the side. It makes a great difference. One much more gentle and one very severe. Now, this is where it also gets very amusing. I made a great generalization about those two paintings. Now, they were also painted for specific collectors. The one on the one in the Louvre, the one for Chanteloup, he was a very jealous collector, and he complained bitterly a couple of years before those paintings were done that Pointel, the other collector, had gotten this particularly beautiful painting, and of course it was all women, and he had gotten this one, which is Ordination, it's all men, and Poussin wrote him a long letter saying, well, there are these different modes, and we must use reason and not always let appetite lead us on, and cribbed a long passage from a book about Doric Greek musical modes. It was only in the 20th century that people realized that it was actually an attributed a quote. But I think, so you see, you see here you have Rebecca at the well, 13 beautiful women. We have Poussin on record saying, I wanted to record as many different types of feminine beauty as I could. Well, Pointel knew what he liked. He asked for this. And so you see there's connivance also in that portrait for Pointel. These are two men who understand each other. I would ask you that the other portrait in the Louvre, would you like to come home to that? Would you like to have that Poussin staring at you in that accusatory way, sort of keeping you up to the mark? Well, not me. Now, here is the Poussin of the tragic mode. This is called The Flood. It's a very, very late painting. It's in the Louvre. It's part of the Four Seasons. Now here, roughly the same period. This is the fall. The grapes, look at them. Isn't that charming? Look at that enormous bunch of grapes. And these peculiar proportions of these men. You see how short their trunk is. Their arms, forearms are so long. Their lower legs are so long. This is really very charming. But here, you see, here's a man who could entertain the hard truth. And after all, Katrina, look at this. The things we've seen. In terms of flooding, it's heartbreaking, and yet here wine. Now this is the very last painting Poussin did. It's at the Louvre. It's unfinished. Again, the lives and loves of the god. It's foolish gods loving mortals. It's Apollo and Daphne, who has refused his advances. Now, this is the second Poussin painting. It's called Poussin's Lake. And what we're now going to do is take a gallop through Poussin. And I want to show you the aquatic side of Poussin's work. And I think this has, when I believe in truth in packaging. When I said this painter's Poussin, I meant it. I look out at the wall.